I recently had to deal with a ridiculous situation involving my property, an HOA, and one very entitled neighbor who thought she could use my backyard as her personal event space. Let me start from the beginning. About a year ago, I moved into a cozy house with a spacious backyard. It was perfect. Quiet, private, and surrounded by a fence. The property borders an HOA community, but thankfully, my house isn't part of it. At first, I had no issues with the neighbors, but that was before I met Karen. For the first few months, everything was normal. I enjoyed my backyard, hosted a few close friends for barbecues, and went about my business like any other homeowner. But then I started noticing something strange. Every so often, I would see people walking through my yard as if they belonged there. At first, I chalked it up to them being lost or mistakenly thinking my backyard was a common area. But then, it kept happening. Not just one or two people, entire groups. One Saturday afternoon, I stepped outside to find a group of well-dressed people laughing, drinking wine, and sitting comfortably in my backyard. They had even started grilling on my barbecue. My initial shock quickly turned into irritation. How had this become a thing? And more importantly, who had the audacity to assume my backyard was open for public use? That's when I first met Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, and the source of all my troubles. Karen, as I later learned, was the de facto ruler of the HOA. She wasn't just a board member, she was the board member. Everything had to go through her. If she approved, it was law. If she didn't, you'd feel the consequences. Unfortunately for me, she had apparently decided long ago that my backyard was an extension of the HOA's communal space. The previous homeowner had, for reasons unknown, allowed the residents to use my yard as a meeting place. That meant Karen and her friends had been hosting garden parties, barbecues, and gatherings there for years. When I confronted the group in my yard that day, I asked, "Excuse me, can I help you?" Expecting apologies or embarrassed excuses, I was instead met with amused smiles. Karen, sipping from her wine glass, turned to me and said, "Oh, hi, we've been using this space for years. The previous owner never minded." I was stunned. "Well, I mind. This is my property. You can't just come in here like you own the place." Karen scoffed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. We're all neighbors here. It's just a little gathering." I firmly told them that my yard was off limits. "I don't know what deal you had with the last owner, but this is my property now. That means no more parties, no more gatherings, and definitely no more using my barbecue." The group exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed. One of Karen's friends rolled her eyes. "It's just a backyard," she muttered. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "All right, fine, if you really insist." They all packed up their chairs, finished their drinks, and shuffled out of my yard like I had just ruined their weekend plans. I figured that was the end of it, but as I would soon find out, Karen wasn't the kind of person to take no for an answer. The next morning, I woke up determined to make it crystal clear that my backyard was not public property. I went outside and installed a sturdy lock on my gate. I also put up a large no trespassing sign, making sure it was visible from the street. Surely that would be enough, right? Wrong. That weekend, I spotted Karen and a few of her HOA friends standing outside my gate, looking irritated. I watched from my window as they tested the lock, seemingly confused about why they couldn't get in. Finally, I decided to step outside. "Looking for something?" I asked, crossing my arms. Karen turned to me with a huff. "Did you seriously lock the gate?" "Yes," I replied, "because it's my yard." She scoffed, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous. We've always used this space. Why are you being so difficult?" I took a deep breath, keeping my voice calm. "Because this isn't a community park. I own this property, and I don't want people using it without my permission." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "You're being unreasonable. We're your neighbors. This is how we build a sense of community." I refused to back down. "You have an entire HOA-managed park down the street. Use that." Her face hardened. "You're making a mistake. The HOA isn't going to like this." At that moment, I realized this wasn't over. Karen wasn't just annoyed, she was furious, and she was about to make my life much more difficult. The following weekend, I was in my living room when I heard loud banging on my gate. Annoyed, I stepped outside to find Karen and a few of her HOA friends standing there, looking absolutely livid. "This is community space," Karen yelled. "You can't just take it away from us." I folded my arms. "It's not community space. It's private property. My private property. One of her friends chimed in. This is unfair. We've been using this yard for years. Just because you moved in doesn't mean you can change everything. I let out a deep breath, keeping my cool. Actually, that's exactly what it means. I own this land, and I decide what happens here. Karen's face turned red. We'll see about that. She turned to her friends and muttered something under her breath before storming off. I thought that would be the end of it, but of course, Karen wasn't done yet. Later that day, I was working in my garage when I heard sirens. I stepped outside to find 2 police officers standing near the gate, with Karen standing smugly beside them. The officer approached me. We received a call about someone blocking public access to a community area. I sighed. This isn't a community area. This is my backyard. Karen jumped in. That's not true. We've always used this space. He can't just take it away from us. The officer turned back to me. Do you have proof that this is your property? I nodded, retrieved my deed, and showed them the property lines. The officer examined it, then nodded. This clearly states that the property belongs to you. Karen's face fell. But we've always... The officer cut her off. Ma'am, this is private property. If he doesn't want you here, you can't be here. Karen looked like she was about to explode, but instead of arguing, she stormed off, muttering, You'll regret this. I had won this battle, but the war was far from over. After Karen stormed off, I expected some sort of retaliation. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go. Over the next few days, I kept an eye out for any unusual activity. Sure enough, Karen was up to something. She started spreading rumors in the neighborhood, telling people that I was being unreasonable and ruining the sense of community. A few neighbors even approached me, trying to convince me to let Karen and her friends continue using my yard. It's just a space for gatherings, one of them said. It's not like they're damaging anything. I shook my head. That's not the point. This is my private property. If they want a communal space, they should take it up with the HOA, not me. Some neighbors backed off, but others weren't happy. A woman muttered under her breath about how selfish I was. Clearly, Karen had been busy turning people against me. A couple of days later, I found a note taped to my front door. It was from Karen, written in dramatic all-caps handwriting. Remove the lock and let us back in, or the HOA will take action. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. If she thought intimidation would work, she was dead wrong. Karen wasn't done yet. A couple of nights after I found her ridiculous note, I checked my security camera footage and saw something disturbing. Karen and a few of her HOA friends had come by my backyard in the middle of the night and were trying to climb over my fence. They weren't just being nosy, they were trespassing. One of them struggled to pull themselves up, while another whispered harshly, "Hurry up. If he sees us, we're screwed." I clenched my jaw as I watched the footage. They didn't manage to get in, but the fact that they even tried was enough for me to take action. The next morning, I called the police and filed a formal trespassing report. The officers reviewed the footage and agreed this wasn't just an accident or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate attempt to violate my property. They told me they'd have a word with Karen. That same evening, I installed more cameras and set up motion-activated lights all around my backyard. If they tried this again, I'd have everything on video. Later that night, I saw Karen storming up and down the sidewalk, grumbling to herself while staring at my new security setup. She knew I had caught her, but she wasn't backing down. The battle was only getting started. A few days after Karen's failed break-in attempt, I received an official letter from the HOA. The envelope had their fancy logo on it, as if that made it more intimidating. Inside was a formal request demanding that I attend a meeting to discuss my actions and their impact on the community. I nearly laughed. I wasn't even part of the HOA, yet they were acting like they had some authority over me. Still, I decided to play along. I wasn't about to ignore this. If they wanted a fight, I'd be ready. I gathered all my legal documents, my property deed, the police report, and security footage of Karen trespassing. When I arrived at the meeting, Karen was seated at the front, flanked by her usual group of HOA loyalists. She had an arrogant smirk on her face like she had already won. The HOA president cleared his throat. "We've received complaints regarding your recent behavior." I raised an eyebrow. "My behavior? You mean Karen's trespassing and harassment?" Karen gasped dramatically. "That's a lie. I was just checking on community space." I pulled out my laptop and played the security footage of Karen trying to climb my fence. The room went silent. Even some of the board members looked uncomfortable. I leaned forward. This is my property. I don't answer to the HOA, and if anyone tries trespassing again, I will press charges. Karen's smirk vanished. For the first time, I saw real doubt on her face. After the board meeting, the HOA members were split. Some seemed to understand they had no case, while others, Karen included, were furious. 2 days later, I got another letter. This time it was less demanding and more conciliatory. We regret any misunderstanding and would like to open a dialogue about a compromise regarding the use of your yard. A compromise? They had to be joking. I ignored the letter. That weekend, I saw Karen standing outside my gate talking to a group of neighbors. They kept glancing over at my house, whispering among themselves. I could already guess what was happening. Karen was spinning another story to turn the community against me. Sure enough, a couple of neighbors approached me the next day, acting like they were doing me a favor. You know, maybe you could just let them use it once in a while, one of them suggested. Yeah, it's such a nice space. It seems like a shame not to share it. I gave them a tight-lipped smile. No thanks. They left looking annoyed, and I knew the HOA wasn't done trying. But neither was I. A week later, I got home to find something absolutely infuriating. A city inspector was standing in my yard, clipboard in hand. Karen had filed a complaint against me, claiming that my fence was out of compliance and needed to be removed. I took a deep breath and walked over. Is there a problem? The inspector looked up, clearly uncomfortable. We received a report about a non-compliant structure, but after measuring, everything seems to be up to code. I smirked. Let me guess, a woman named Karen filed the complaint? The inspector sighed. I can't say who, but you're not the first person she's reported. Of course. As the inspector packed up and left, I saw Karen standing at her window, watching me with a scowl. She knew she had lost again, but she wasn't ready to give up. At this point, I was beyond tired of Karen's antics. She had filed a false complaint with the city, tried to turn my neighbors against me, and even called the police over my own backyard. It was time to flip the script. I reached out to a local news station that covered HOA disputes and property rights issues. I sent them a detailed email explaining how the HOA had been harassing me over my privately owned land and how Karen had escalated things to calling the police and trying to get my fence taken down. The response was almost immediate. A reporter reached out, eager to interview me. The moment I explained everything, he was hooked. A week later, the segment aired. The headline? Local HOA tries to take over homeowner's backyard and calls the cops when he says no. The story spread like wildfire. HOA horror stories were always popular, and this one was particularly outrageous. Within days, the backlash against Karen and her HOA was brutal. Neighbors, city officials, and even other HOA communities started talking about it. People called in to complain about how HOAs had too much power, and some even shared their own Karen stories. The best part? Within days, I heard from several people that Karen had been removed from the HOA board. Her reign of terror was finally over. But the fight wasn't quite finished yet. With Karen officially removed from the HOA board, I expected things to settle down. But the damage she had done was still lingering. Some board members were still salty about losing control over my yard, and a few die-hard HOA loyalists weren't ready to give up. A week after the news story aired, I received yet another letter from the HOA. This one, however, had a different tone. Instead of their usual demanding and threatening approach, this letter was almost apologetic. We regret any misunderstanding and would like to open a dialogue about a compromise regarding the use of your yard. A compromise? After months of harassment, trespassing, police calls, and false complaints, they still had the nerve to ask for a compromise? I didn't even bother responding. They lost. The next HOA meeting was held just days later, and from what I heard, it was a disaster. Without Karen leading the charge, the other board members were left scrambling to justify why they had been harassing a private homeowner over land they never had any claim to. A few remaining HOA supporters tried to argue that I was being selfish, but they were shut down immediately by other homeowners who were tired of Karen's drama. The final decision was clear. The HOA would no longer pursue any type of community access to my property. I had won, but I wasn't finished just yet. Even though the HOA had officially surrendered, I knew that Karen herself wasn't going to back down quietly. She had lost her position of power, been humiliated on local news, and was now the laughingstock of the neighborhood. But instead of apologizing or owning up to her actions, she did what any entitled person does when they've lost. She played the victim. For the next couple of weeks, she sulked around, avoiding eye contact with anyone who had sided against her. I caught glimpses of her peering out her window whenever I was outside, her face twisted in frustration. She wasn't used to losing, and it was eating her alive. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's house. At first, I thought it was some kind of desperate bluff, a way to guilt the neighborhood into begging her to stay. But no, within a few days, real estate agents started showing up, taking photos of the house. It was really happening. Karen was leaving. The HOA had turned against her, the neighborhood wanted nothing to do with her, and she had become a public embarrassment thanks to the news story. She had no more power, no more control, and no more allies. The last time I saw her, she was standing in her driveway, watching movers load up a truck. Her face was locked in a permanent scowl as she glared in my direction. I gave her a friendly wave. She got in her car and sped off without looking back. Karen was gone. And my backyard? Mine. Forever. With Karen gone for good, the neighborhood finally felt normal again. No more HOA letters, no more people lingering around my fence, and most importantly, no more drama. I could finally enjoy my backyard the way I had always intended, as a private space for me and my invited guests. But this whole ordeal taught me some valuable lessons. First and foremost, entitled people will take as much as you allow them to. If I had given in to Karen's demands in the beginning, my backyard would have forever been treated as public property. She would have continued hosting parties, treating my BBQ like her own, and making me feel like a guest on my own land. Second, HOAs can be bullies, but they only have as much power as you let them. I wasn't even a part of the HOA, yet they tried to intimidate me with fake authority and empty threats. But as soon as I stood my ground, they had nothing. And finally, the most important lesson of all, document everything. If I hadn't taken photos, saved letters, and installed security cameras, I wouldn't have been able to prove the trespassing, the harassment, or Karen's false claims. I hope the neighborhood had learned something from all this too. For the first time since I moved in, the community felt peaceful. People were friendlier, less nosy, and more respectful of property lines. It seemed that Karen's downfall had served as a lesson for everyone. Even though Karen was gone, the HOA still had a mess to clean up. Their failed attempt to claim my backyard had made them look bad, not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood. For weeks after Karen left, I noticed something odd. The HOA had suddenly gone quiet. No letters, no policy reminders in my mailbox, no surprise complaints about my fence or property. It was like they were pretending nothing had ever happened. Then, out of nowhere, an HOA board member I had never spoken to before, an older guy named Greg, knocked on my door. "We just wanted to reach out," he said awkwardly, "to apologize for any, misunderstandings." I had to fight the urge to laugh in his face. "Oh, you mean the months of harassment?" I asked. "Or when Karen called the cops on me over my own yard?" Greg winced, but nodded. "Look, Karen was out of control, and we let things go too far. She caused a lot of problems for all of us." It was clear the HOA was desperate to repair their reputation. They wanted to make nice so that I wouldn't take legal action or go to the news again. I crossed my arms. "So, what do you want?" Greg sighed. "We just wanted to make sure there are no hard feelings. And maybe you'd reconsider joining the HOA. I laughed out loud. Not a chance. Greg left looking defeated. The HOA had lost, and they knew it. With Karen gone, and the HOA thoroughly embarrassed, life finally started to feel normal again. For the first time since I moved in, I could actually enjoy my backyard in peace. No more unexpected guests, no more arguments, and no more passive-aggressive letters. But the fallout from Karen's antics didn't just disappear overnight. Neighbors who had once sided with her were now avoiding me altogether. The ones who had defended her trespassing didn't even bother making eye contact when I walked past. Others, however, had a completely different reaction. One evening, an older couple who lived a few houses down stopped me while I was out walking my dog. "We just wanted to say," the woman started, "that we're sorry about how things turned out. Karen had a way of convincing people to do things they probably shouldn't have." Her husband nodded. To be honest, a lot of us never liked the way she ran things, but speaking up against her was difficult. That didn't surprise me. Karen had ruled the HOA with an iron fist, and it was clear that people had been too afraid to cross her. Now that she was gone, the entire community felt different, quieter, less controlling, more relaxed. I wasn't about to forgive the people who had harassed me, but I appreciated the ones who admitted they were wrong. At least now, the neighborhood had a chance to move forward. And so did I.